And so now I must consider all of these fine graduates as my friends and my colleagues. People working in common for the good of all the earth. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce the first of these new friends and colleagues. Linnea M. Palmer Paton is a graduate of the class of 2011 with a degree in civil engineering and environmental planning. She has been a local coordinator for the Students for a Just and Stable Future, and next year plans to continue her studies at New York University's Urban Planning Program, studying renewable and equitable energy resources as a means of planning the cities of the future. It is my pleasure to welcome her now.
I was asked to speak a little bit about why we did what we did today. So for those of you who are just coming in now, several students and I declined to attend the address by Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil. And it's important for me that you understand that this was not about not listening. This is not about us versus them. This is about having integrity to our values and to future generations, and about the kind of world that we are leaving for them. This is about the angst and frustration I feel every day when I turn on my car and I have this tightening feeling in my gut because I know I need to go to work to pay off the loans that help give me this education that lets me know that turning on my car and burning fossil fuels is not the right thing to do. But since there are few alternatives available to me as of now that I can afford, it's a tough place to be. I'm like, well, what do I do? And so what we're doing here today is we are speaking out. We are demanding the kind of future that we want for ourselves and for our children. And we are insisting that we get off fossil fuels. So today was a symbol of that, and specifically a symbol that we hope that ExxonMobil now and very soon in the future will also help be a part of that and be a part of the renewable energy future that we need. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I came to be here and my journey to becoming an environmental humanitarian, and as my friend Katrina Crocker would like to put it, a world activist. So one of my earliest memories is of the Housatonic River. I would play by the bank while my father kayaked in the whitewater. I must have been 5 or 6 when I decided to cover myself in mud from the river. I had covered my legs almost up to my knees when I heard my father shouting at me. I felt confused. As he came closer, I could hear him telling me to stop. Stop immediately. As I washed the mud off my shins, he explained that there was something in the mud that could make me sick. He called them PCBs. I still didn't understand. He tried to explain more. He told me that General Electric, an industrial company, used to dump their waste in the river before we knew that it caused cancer. Even at a young age, I knew that was bad. Now that I'm older, I realize that the trace of mounds of PCBs in the mud near the surface probably wouldn't have hurt me. But that doesn't change the grief I feel when I remember that to this day, you cannot eat the fish from that river. What's worse is my children will not eat fish from that river. I'm also vegetarian, so I'm not going to eat fish from the river anyway. But, for generations, this river is not going to be able to sustain healthy ecosystems. And so I'm hit with a sense of awe at how much the choices we make today will make a difference for the generations and generations of people to come. Looking at previous generations, I am glad to say that I had the pleasure of meeting my great-grandfather, Reuben, when I was about 10 years old. He was in his late 90s then, and I remember thinking that he looked old and wrinkly, but he had very kind eyes. He lived in Indiana, which was far from Connecticut, so I didn't see him often, and I remember hearing that he had passed on. After his passing, I began reading voraciously in middle school. I read about the Holocaust and World War II. I read about the victims of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I read fictional pieces on nuclear war. I remember being horrified at humans' capacity to kill and destroy one another. I remember thinking how stupid it is that we still haven't learned that might doesn't make right. And I felt despair about reading about the abuses suffered by women and children, especially in war-torn regions, and the poverty and hunger suffered there. I was furious as I read the history of indigenous people being forced off their land, often to die or be killed, so that those who thought they were right could profit, whether financially or by just having access to the land. In high school, I started studying environmental issues through the Canon Envirothon program. I'd stay after school twice a week to study wildlife management, forestry, aquatic ecology, and soil science, which was my favorite. When I was a junior, my team went to nationals in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where we studied climate change. We learned the most crucial scientific fact about our century. Warmer air holds more water, and in the future, more of that fresh water will move from where it is stored right now in glaciers down into the atmosphere. From the lakes and rivers, it will be absorbed into the atmosphere because it is now warmer. 1.1 billion people live without enough potable water. They will have less water available still. Los Angeles is watching the great Colorado River that brings its drinking water is running dry. More water in the air because it's warmer, less water to drink, and less food to grow it with. Less food to get water needs. So in Manitoba, we learned that Lake Winnipeg, which is as big as any of the other Great Lakes, is dying because it is being overloaded with fertilizer and nutrient runoff from the plains in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The fertilizer and nutrients runs off and then is eaten up by the algae, which then grows explosively and eats and consumes all the oxygen in the water, making it so that other aquatic organisms can't breathe and they die. Here in the US, fertilizer runoff has riddled the Chesapeake Bay and making dead zones in areas around there. And then we learned that global warming makes this whole problem worse, even though it's not quite obvious how if you don't know the chemistry. What happens is that warmer water also holds less oxygen, so it makes the issue worse. In my senior year of high school, my team won a place at nationals in Geneva, New York, where we studied renewable energy. We toured the colossal Niagara Falls hydro plant and learned about the wind farms developed alongside agricultural land out in the Finger Lakes. My team ended up winning first place in large part because of a presentation we developed on how to power our school with renewable energy. Sometime during high school, I learned that my great-grandfather was a chemist. He worked for Standard Oil, who, if you haven't heard, is basically the great-grandfather of all the big oil companies today. Yes, I know he invented some important things, but I can't help think that if he had known the effects of the industry he was supporting, that maybe he would have acted differently. Maybe he would have worked for someone else. Maybe he would have started his own company. Isn't it funny that I should find myself at odds with the grandchild of a company that my great-grandfather worked for? My own great-grandparents Were they thinking deeply about the long-term impacts of the technological world that they helped create? Did they have foresight for 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, for 100? How about 1,000 years? Is it possible for us to survive without thinking about our effects of our actions 1,000 years ahead? I don't know. But we do know much more now than we did then. We know better than to dump our waste carelessly. We no longer dump chemicals in the Housatonic. We have a long-term outlook, and hopefully one day that river will be clean. But we still dump our CO2 waste, carbon dioxide, into the sky. We know the consequences. The sky has a finite capacity. We even have pictures to prove that. When you see pictures of the Earth, there's this snug, thin layer of atmosphere hugging the planet. Why are we using this space as a dumpster? Dumpster space is expensive. We're dumping our waste currently for free. And I am sad to say that environmental problems are not just in history books, like I read when I was in high school. These problems are still here, happening right now, this day. Oil and gas companies are forcing people, sometimes indigenous people, off their land to drill for oil and explore gas, coal as well. We are forcing people off their land to extract fossil fuels for greedy profits, and they are doing it in our name, saying that it's our lifestyle that requires it because we have no other alternatives, or if we do, we're not ready to implement them yet. For instance, there was a case just recently in India that ExxonMobil won, where they will be exploring for oil and gas. So, the truth is, I do want my electric car, or whatever car they can get. I would like to ride trains to Houston, and I am doing everything in my power to get them. And I'm asking, what are the companies doing to get us to the kind of future that we need? Surprisingly, there are a lot of companies that support a carbon tax with if you tax CO2 emissions and stop dumping for free, you can actually make it revenue neutral and reduce taxes in somewhere else. For instance, if you reduce taxes on working, which is something you want people to do, you want people to work, but instead, and also tax consumption and pollution, then you could maybe get a system that would drive innovation in the economy. But we don't have that yet, and I wonder why. I'm like, well, if this is really what we want, and this is what the companies say they want, where are the ads advertising for this? Where are the people speaking out about this? I know there are some of them in the audience today, but why hasn't this happened yet? I'd also like to add that I realize I could be working on so many other problems: disease prevention, homelessness, indigenous rights, fair trade, anti-corruption laws, the list goes on and on. But I'm not. I'm working on climate change. Why? Because global warming affects all of the social justice issues of this world, as well as the environmental ones. It has the potential to undermine all of the progress we have made so far in our humanitarian efforts and make matters much, much worse. As I said, hotter temperatures means there's more water in the atmosphere. That means more drought, more extreme flooding when it does rain. What good is disease prevention if everyone is starving because the drought killed all the crops, or when infectious diseases spread to more areas of the world because the temperature is now warm enough to host them? What good is fighting homelessness now when severe weather events like extreme flooding become more common and displace millions of people? What good is protecting the land of indigenous people in Bangladesh, the Maldives, and in the outer islands around Australia, when their countries will be underwater or practically uninhabitable by the end of this century? I'd like to also mention what our caps mention. They say